Okay, so I'm going to start with the slides, but in fact, the slides, they don't have that much information. We're going to do a lot of examples today, and hopefully the examples will help us get more situated with the DOM and how to manipulate it through JavaScript. So the DOM, what is the DOM? Anyone any idea what is the DOM? Have you read about it? Have you heard it before or worked with this? No? In general, do you have any previous experience like, sorry, Charlene, you said.
Something about manipulating the whole, connecting the HTML and JavaScript, but not so much experience on it and getting elements from somewhere.
Yes. Yes, that's what we are going to be doing, basically, using JavaScript to get, as we say, elements from the HTML to manipulate, change them, add, remove, whatever we want to do. So, so DOM, we will see what is DOM. We'll see today what are the ways that JavaScript can manipulate the DOM, and what is an event handler. So events are also a very important part of this. To start with the DOM, DOM is actually the initials of document object model. It is a way of transforming our HTML, an HTML page, in a representation that can be understandable by other programming languages. So if we wanted to work with the HTML in JavaScript, JavaScript doesn't understand HTML, so it doesn't understand the structure because it is a totally different structure. It would need to have this whole thing like what is an HTML page in an object format, because JavaScript can work with objects. And so it's easier for JavaScript and also other programming languages to work with an object. And that's what we are doing with, when we say with a DOM model, it's a modeling of our HTML page in a tree format, in an object format. So we transform all the elements of our HTML page in tree nodes. Starting, the root element is our HTML, so the HTML tag. So if you have in mind an HTML page, a simple HTML page, it always starts with an HTML tag. And this is our root, because then you see that everything is nested in here. And if you remember from the trees, we were starting from a root and then we had different children. And so in this, for example, case, we have HTML that has two direct children, a head and a body. So these two children hang from HTML because they are nested inside HTML. Then the head node, the head child, has other three children, this meta tag, and this meta tag, this link tag. And the body can have many more children. So we take this and we transform this to a tree with our root being HTML, and then each of the tag being a node or an element. Node and element are basically interchangeable. Node is a more generic term. Everything that we have here is a node, while element refers to the HTML tags that are elements, because there are also nodes that are not elements. So a text node when we go inside nesting, and we find some text, so we have an H1 element, and inside it has some text. This also, the text itself is a node, but it's not an element. It's just a text node. Okay, so this is a small difference. So if we go back to here, to our example, the body, it's a node, and it's also an element. H1, it's also an element. And then this text in here, it's a text node. Okay, it's also part of our tree, but it is only text, and so it's called the text node. But basically, this is somehow the structure that we transform our HTML2 in a tree format. A root, a head, body, and then some nodes hanging inside there. And also we have the attributes. You have seen on Friday in the HTML review that there are, in the tags, we have some attributes that are we use to specify some properties of the element. So for example, for a link element, we had the href attribute, which make reference to which link we are going to link to. And so this is an attribute. And this is also part of the tree as a node. And so on Friday, you have reviewed the HTML a bit quickly, and that's good because we are not going to do HTML now or later. I mean, we suppose we have some knowledge, background knowledge from this, but you are going to need HTML. So it's good that you have reviewed it on Friday, and I hope you had some time on the weekend to do that. Some common elements, remember that we have the headings that go from H1 to H6, H1 being the bigger one, H6 the smaller one. Then for text, we use the P for paragraph or the span for inline text, if we want to mark some text with some different styling. On the forms, when we want to create a form, we have also the form tag, which includes everything else, so that is the outside tag of a form. And then inside we have inputs, we have some text area, we can have select buttons, radio buttons, we have submit buttons, we have labels, so we have different tags that are all part of the forms. And then we have some elements that we use for layout. For example, div is a very useful one, a very popular one that we use to mark sections and to modify some layout of that section. Section is also another tag. Some of them, especially section, nav, footer, and header, these all are semantic also. They hold some semantic meaning, which is good if we can use them. It's very easy to do everything with div. So you don't really need to use section, nav, footer, or header. You can do everything with divs, but it's a very big issue, the semantic meaning of HTML. HTML5 has put a lot of effort on adding some semantics so that it can be also easily read for people with some disabilities, that they use some reader, so that sections, they have also a meaning. It's not just a section, just a div, because a div is very generic, can be anything. But if you use footer instead of div, you specify that this is the last part of your page and it is a footer, so it has some semantic meaning. And so there are some elements that we can use most for this, for adding also semantic meaning to our page. And then we have for list, the unordered list, that's the U4, the ordered list, and then the list element, the list item. That's why it's the LI. Okay, so I think most of those you have seen, and we will work with some of those later. And so now what we want to do is also be able to manipulate this DOM. That's why we also created in this object model format. And JavaScript was actually created for this. One of the main reasons at the beginning, historically, of when JavaScript was created was to be able to validate forms, to work with forms, and to be able to get the inputs and validate that the inputs were as expected, correct, etc. So that's why also we have seen that JavaScript works with browser, or initially at least the JavaScript engine was created to work in a browser. And then with the Node, we managed to like export this engine to work also with JavaScript programs on our laptop. But it was meant for this, it was created for this. And it can add, change, remove any HTML element and attribute of a page. So we can create new elements, you can remove some of the elements, and you can modify them. You can change the CSS styles in the page. Be careful here, because JavaScript cannot access the CSS file. So when we say that it can change the CSS styles, this is a bit tricky here. I don't want it to be misleading, because when you use JavaScript, you know, we normally have an index, an HTML, not index, an HTML file. And then we may have a JavaScript file with some code, some JavaScript code. And then maybe we have some styles CSS file. So JavaScript cannot access this CSS file directly. It cannot come in here and modify things. But we will see how it can use the styles to modify styles of our elements. Okay, so it can change styles in the page, and it can react to events in the page, existing or create new events. And event is also a big issue with JavaScript. That's one of its main power is to create and use events. So how can we add, change, and remove HTML elements? First of all, in order to be able to do anything with them, we need to be able to get a whole grab on them, right? Query elements, so find an element. So let's start with an example. Here, I have this very simple page that doesn't have anything. If you check, remember that the head is basically metadata. It's not something that is visible. On our HTML page, the body is the visible part. And so if you check this body, it just have an H1 title and the script. So the script makes reference links to a JavaScript file. And normally we put this as a last line inside the body. Okay, so as to link to the JavaScript file. And in this case, I have called this JavaScript file playground. And you can specify here that the type is JavaScript. So if I run this, I'm going to run this on with a live server. Sorry, where did it go? Here. So we just see this H1, right? The title that we have created. And if we open the inspector, so now we will be, until now we were just using the console. Now we will start using a bit more. We will need a bit more room because we need to see here the HTML part. We will see here the CSS part, and then we may also need to access the console. So here on what we see here on the body, I just have this H1 tag and the script line. So if I want to access this element, there are various ways that I can do this. So one way would be to access it. We start with document, which is like the root or where's the starting point of trying to accessing elements. Document is the whole visible area. So we have the document that is all what we see. And then we also have the window, which also includes the URL line. And so if we want to do something with this part here, the URL, then we would need to access window.something. But if not, if we just want to play with what we see in here, we start with document. And here we have many methods. Document is a very big object that has lots of methods, hundreds of methods already created. And it's your entrance to the DOM tree. So if you just write like document dot, then you see here all the methods that are available. And you see there are many on the document. And one of them would be get element. So if you start typing get element, you will see different ways of grabbing an element. Get element by ID, get element by class name, get element by name, by tag name, etc. So if in my H1 I have an ID, so here this was a very simple H1, but let me modify it and I just add an ID here. So ID here. So now if I use the, I don't know if this is too small, let me make it a bit bigger. Get element by ID, and I specify which ID I want to grab. Remember that IDs are unique, so there is only going to be one element with this ID. So this will return me this H1 element, the whole thing. So with a get element by ID, if I use an ID, I can get this element. I can query all the HTML and select this element that has this ID. Now, of course, I did not store it anywhere, so I just did it like this so as to check what it does in return. But the ideal would be to store it somewhere. So, for example, let's do a variable. So what we do here is JavaScript. So we can store whatever this method returns to a variable. So let header equals get element by ID. And then this header stores this H1 that I have grasped. So if I just write here header, you see that I get this H1 in return. So I can get this with the get element by ID, but of course there are other methods. So another way of getting this element would be, and so like we will see that it give us the same thing, would be document with a query selector. Query selector. Okay, this is also very popular. This is going to be very useful. In the query selector, we specify any CSS selector in here that can match the element that we want to get. So, for example, if I specify H1, it will give me the first H1 that it encounters, because of course in a page it can be more than one H1 or more than one divs, and so it's not enough sometimes to just say get me the div. Yes, but which div? So if you want to be more specific, you either need to use some ID, or you need to we will see some other methods as well when we have more than one item. So as I was saying, query selector is also another way of grasping an element, and you specify in here what would be a selector, a CSS selector. So it can be a tag, it can be a class name, it can be an ID. So I can do the same thing, query selector, and specify an ID. And remember, in CSS, IDs are marked with a hashtag. So if I mark that I want the element with ID header, it will still give me the same element. So query selector is a bit multi-purpose. That's why it's also so useful, because you can put anything in there. You can put a tag by its tag name. You can put an ID. You can put a class name. And so it will return the first element that matches this thing that you have specified inside. So there are various ways of getting elements. You could even get elements by how they are related to each other in the tree. So since this is a tree, we have a parent-child relationship, right? So we could also get document body, how is it, get first child. What is with the child node? So you have also some methods that you can take all the nodes that are children of an element. So if we are on a body, then we would take all the nodes that are children of. But we normally don't go that much with the parent-child relationship. We go with these easier methods, either the get element by a specific thing like a tag name or an ID, or with a query selector. So we can query an element and we can grasp it, and then we can try to change some of its attributes. So in this case, H1 doesn't have many things to change, but we could try to change what the text that is in here. So this good morning FSPT 15T. So remember that I have stored this in the header here, in the header variable. So I could just go and say header dot inner HTML. There are 2 or 3 different ways to change the text. One would be inner HTML, the other one would be inner text. And so set it to something else. Bye team. So you see that now it's changed. I have initially grasped this element here. I got this element by selecting it with its ID. And then I did some modification to it. So I changed the text in this case. With the inner text, it means that I modify the text that is inside the tags. That's what it means in inner text. So inside the tags of this element, I can modify this text. And what else I could do here? So I could also create a new element. In order to create a new element, again, let's say I'm going to create a paragraph. Document, create element. So if you don't really remember how something is written, you can start typing a bit and then this help will come up. And so create element of type P. So like that, I have created this P element, but of course you see there is nowhere in here. I can put some text in it as well. So paragraph. So now this is called paragraph, the one that I have created. And I can also set the inner text to be something. Okay, I have set this, but you see also that it doesn't appear anywhere on the page. And it's not appearing here on my code either. Why is that? Any ideas?
Is it because it didn't specify where it goes exactly?
Yes. So this is very similar to what we did with trees. You can create a node, but then you need to attach it to something. So it needs to be a child of something, because if not, it's a node that is just floating on the air. And right now I have created this paragraph node and I have set some text to it, but it's not attached anywhere. And I always need to specify where I will attach it. And in order to do this, I choose like an element, for example, body, and I want to attach it to here, document body, better, document dot body, append, and then I use this append, and inside pass the paragraph. So now you see it here, very small, because, okay, it's a paragraph. And now you will see it also inside the body on the end, because when we append something, it's always going like it's going to be the last child. If we imagine this body having some children inside, one is the H1, another one is the script, every tag every element is a children. Then the P element is the last one to be attached with the append. And so it appears now here. So whenever I create an element, I always need to remember to attach it also somewhere. If not, I cannot see it. Okay, with the append, I have created this paragraph. I can change it, and we can also try to modify some of its styling. So we can change the style attributes or class list. We have two ways of changing the style of an element. One is by adding a class to it in the class list. So the class list includes all the classes of this element, and we can add a new class. Or we can alter the style attributes. So if you remember in the next, so I'm going to go back here to the code. It's a bit easier to work. So for example, this one, it can have a style attribute that has some inline styling. Okay, so so that the text color, for example, is red. And so if I see this here, so now the text color is red. So see also here, of course, that the paragraph has disappeared when the page reloaded, because whatever I do here, it's not permanent on my code, it's just for testing and for playing. And the same thing happens also if I want to play with CSS. So if I go here and I change and I want to try different colors, I can select an element and then see the styles of this element here, and then maybe I don't like red and I want to play what would if I put blue violet, and I see it. But then this is not saved anywhere. At the moment I will reload the page, it will go back to what it was saved on the file. Okay, so this here is a good way of try different things when we want to play with CSS, because we don't know what is not working. We can unclick and click and activate and deactivate different things. And we will see styles that we have created. There are some styles that are inherited. So all this styling here for the H1, it's inherited because it is set by the user agent. When it says the user agent, it's like what the Chrome already has as preset for an H1. So these styles are not in your CSS file. They have been already set in Chrome for all its H1, but you can override this if you put something else here. So for example, it says font size 2 EM, but if I want to have a font size of 4 EM, then I can override this, and you will see that it appears here with this strike through line. That means that this doesn't have any effect anymore, doesn't work, because I have something that overridden, a rule that overridden this. So this style attribute, so we are in here in this H1 tag, and we have this style attribute. And so this style attribute has some things that we can also affect with JavaScript. Okay, so again, I select, if I want to change something, I select my H1. Let's use get element, no ID, I don't have, I will use the query selector. H1. So I have this header. And then if I want to modify something, I can use the header.style that refers to this attribute. And then I can add anything that I would add in CSS, colors, border, background color, whatever I want. So let's try with background color. Background color, and I can set it to what would be red, or not red, yellow. You can use names here for the colors. There are many that are, I think we can find. So before I go to the colors, you see that it added this background color yellow in the style attribute. Be careful here, one thing, because since this is JavaScript, so what I'm doing here, this part of the code is JavaScript, it's not CSS. So I do refer to a CSS attribute that is the background color, and in CSS is written like this, sorry, with the dash in between the words. But if I was trying to use this here, it will give me an error. So if I wanted to say background color like this, it will give me an error. So because JavaScript understands this as an operation, as if I'm trying to remove something from something else, as a mathematical operation. Okay, so instead, when I'm working with the JavaScript, all the CSS attributes that are written like this in this CSS are transformed to camel case. So they are transformed to written like this with the second word with capital. Okay, to the camel case. So one way of changing styles in an element would be to just directly add them in the style attribute. The style attribute is the inline styling of an element. But normally we don't have all the styles like that inline. Normally we have in CSS, we have some classes created, and then each element has a class. So for that, I first need to have the class created in CSS. So let's say I have here my tag CSS, and I'm going to create a class that I'm going to call red, and or red background. And what it will do, it will change the background color to red. So, oh, I don't know, some other more dark orchid. It's okay. I will call it new background, the class. And so when I apply this class to my element, it will have this background color. If I wanted to do it not with CSS, like old-fashioned directly writing the HTML, I would come in here and I will apply class equals, and I will call this new background class. I will apply this class to my H1. And so if you see it, you will see it has this violet background color. But let's remove it, because I can actually add this class through JavaScript as well. So if imagine this element didn't have any class and I want to apply this styling, I could add the style in here in the inline style attribute with the, as I did before, take the element and write this dot style dot background color, or I could, let me select it again, the header, or add to its class list, add, no, sorry, this is add, class lists. I don't remember, no, it's a header dot class lists. And I add the class that I have created, which is the new background. No, I don't have this ID. So you see what the error is here. I use the get element by ID header, but I have not this header doesn't have an ID. This is something I did before in another example. So this header doesn't have an ID header. So when I did this, it did not select any element. Get element by ID means it was trying to find an ID header to select an element, but this didn't have any ID, so it did not select it, and it was null. Let me try with a query selector. H1. So now I have the header selected, and I can add this new background class to this. Not take effect, is it called? New background. New background. I think now it's header dot. Lists, add. No,
Sorry, Anna, can I have a question?
Yes, sorry, I will find it because sometimes the syntax is a bit, I don't remember it exactly. Tell me.
Yeah, why is it good for us? Because it seems extremely difficult to
Yes.
me. So what is it? Yeah, the good thing for us that use.
So the idea is not to create the whole page like this. So let me start with that. So of course, now we are just playing and we see how we can create an element or we can modify it. But of course, this is very hard to work with, cumbersome. And so it's not that you are going to come here and create each of these elements one by using the JavaScript. So it's more the opposite way. You have some part of the page that is static that you have already created with its styles and everything. And then at some point, you want to add some interaction. So now I'm just creating these elements like this, but maybe I would just want to have a button that when I, or when I click this, it will do something. It will appear something. And so, and the moment that I'm creating this event, that when I click a button, it will appear, it will change the title. So I could also do that with events. And so, although now it seems that we're creating the whole HTML like this, it's not going to be the case. You will have a lot of part of the HTML already created in a normal way, and then you are just going to do some things to add the interaction. Because yes, of course, this is not the most optimal way to work with.
Okay, thank you.
So you can, this is for changing again, because also maybe you wanted to change dynamically some of the styles, and you wanted that when I click on the header, it changes the title, so the color. So let me refresh this. I could create an event listener. Before that, I will go to the event listeners. So in order to be able to react and to do this kind of interaction, you need to have some event listener to interact with all the existing events in the page. And for this, we use the add event listener. And we have lots of events to listen to from user interaction. It can be mouse events, it can be keyboard events, it can be finger events like on a touch screen, like scroll up, scroll down, etc. And we can interact to all these events from the user and react and do something. So let me see, I have somewhere with the events. Where are the events? There is a link. Okay, this one. In the MDN, the Mozilla documentation, you can find a list of all the events that exist that we can interact. And so these are some of the mouse events. So these are just the mouse events, because we also have keyboard events and we have full screen events. So at the moment that you get to a full screen, do something. So we have many events to watch and listen to. And so, for example, for mouse events, a click is the one that we're going to use a lot also now. At the moment that someone is clicking to a button or to any element, then do something. Or the double click, or the mouse down, mouse enter, mouse leave, mouse move. So you see that we have a lot of events here. And so we can try the click and see how it works. So let me add an ID here so that we can also grab this through ID. Okay. So imagine I want to add an event so that when I click on this header, it changes color or something. So first I will need to add what is called an event listener. So I'm grabbing the element. So I always start by selecting the element to which I want to work with. So I select this element, I call it header, I will store it in a variable, and I have this element selected. I have this element, it's my H1. Then I need to add some event listener. And when we add the event listener, we first specify what type of event I'm going to listen to, for example, a click. So I'm going to expect for a mouse click on this element here, and then a callback function of what this is going to do. So the callback function, I will call it change color. Of course, now this callback function is not defined anywhere. So if I click, nothing is going to happen. But if I define a callback function like this, it will work. So yes, you see that now this function is not defined. I will actually do it in the JS file, the same thing, but I will do it in the JS file so that I can also write my function here. So as I was saying, I'm going to first grab my element, document, get the element by ID, and I have this element. And I'm going to add an event listener to this, that when this is clicked, it will change the color of the text. This change color is a callback function that I have still not created. So now I need to create this callback function. So this is normal JavaScript. I have a function, change color, that when I click on this and this function is called, then what we'll do it will get this header and style, and it will put the color to be green. So I have a small function that when I will click on the element, this function will be called, and when this function is called, it will take this element and it will change the style, the color to green. Okay, you see the process of how it works? I first select an element, I add an event listener, specify what type of event, and specify which function is going to be called. Careful here, because here I'm just specifying the function, same as we were doing with the callback function. I'm not calling the function. So here you should not put the parentheses, because here I'm not calling the function at this moment. I'm just specifying that this function will be called in the future when the click will be done. Okay, and I'm setting which is the handler for this event. This is a handler function, okay, that it handles this event. And so if I run this now, and this has this function, and supposedly when I click it, it changes the color. Okay, so I clicked it, I can refresh, I click on top of this element, it detected the click, it called the function, it changed the color. So for this type of things and interaction, and to make our pages more attractive and more interactive, is where we are going to be using this. In this case here, see that I don't have to actually define the H1 element from start and the inner text and everything here. I can have it already created in my HTML page, which is easier. I can have it in here, create it with some initial styling, with IDs, whatever I want, and also have more content here. But if I want to have interaction and I want to have these event listeners, then I need to be able to grab elements, to have some functions, and to put together these interactions like this. So we will see more examples, but some questions here. So with the events listeners, we can grab things that will be happening from the user by mouse, but by keyboard, as I was saying, by changing of the screen size, by scrolling down. There are hundreds of events, and you can use them as you want. So here there is an example similar to what we did. First, we create an element. So with the create element, we create a div element, and we store it in a variable L. then we put some inner HTML to this element. So see here that when we want to also add some HTML tags, we use the inner HTML method and not the inner text. Inner text is only if I want to add text directly. But if I want also to have some HTML written inside the quotes, then I use the inner HTML. So here I created a div. I added inside the div a paragraph with the text hello world, and I append this child to the body. And so I have here a process of just creating an element and creating a child. What if you want to create a lot of similar elements? We will see also an example from this, because of course, if I want to create many paragraphs, creating them one by one, it's not the best solution. The good way would be to create a function that creates these things. So with a paragraph, it doesn't make much sense, but we can see it with a list. And so let me go back to our example here. And let's say I have a list. I want to create an unordered list that will have some elements inside, like, for example, elements of food. So I'm starting with, and I can see it here. It's very small. And then I want to add some more elements. Maybe I have an array from somewhere with some food elements. Favorite food. And I have an array, and I have some ice cream, ice cream is food, but anyway, or some tacos, or I don't know, spaghetti. I don't know how it's written. Spaghetti. It's written like this. I think not. Spaghetti. Anyway. So I have an array of elements that I want to add to this unordered list that I have created. How can I do that? I can have a function that will take a for loop, will go over through the array, and will create a list item for each one of my elements. So now these examples may seem that why do I need to do it in this more complex way and not directly go there and create the list items? But imagine that, of course, this in a normal situation, in a bigger project, you get some array from something that you have created by modifying some parameters or from some external source, and then you want to represent these things in your page. So you get, for example, some images from somewhere, from an API, you get some images and you want to show them to your page, and you want to do some kind of automatic way of doing that. So let me put this. This is one example. And so I could go with the for each item. And so what do I want to do? I want to grab this and I want to create a new element. So let list item is a create element. So I want to create a list item. I want to add this text that is the item of my array. So this text will be the inner text of my list item. And then I want to append this list item to the unordered list that I have created. So remember here, I have already an unordered list created with one item, and I want to append all these other list items in here. So I'm going to just grab the UL. So I need to grab it first so that I can work with it, and I append children to this. So let UL document query selector UL. I'm getting this. and URL append child, the list item I have created. So in fact, this I don't have to repeat it all the time. I can just have it here. So I create the new list item, I add the text that I get from the array to this, and then I append it to my child. And you see that already it appeared here because I saved, and this runs automatically. It's not a function, I don't need to call it. So it runs automatically. But for example, imagine that I wanted to, instead of change color, I wanted to do this when my title is clicked. So I can just take all this code and add it to this change color function. The name is not very. Now I have this, and when I click this, these items appear because it already creates automatically with the for loop all the list items and adds them to my unordered list. So when we want to create lots of similar elements, you can create a function that creates this. And you can also use some kind of data structure like an object or an array to keep track of them in your GS file. This now I think we will come back to this when we will find it in some example, because maybe you are creating different elements and you want to store them somewhere in some kind of data structure like an object or an array, so that you know that I have created these list items. So all these list items that I now created, I appended them, but maybe I want also to store them. I can also store them. They are variables that I have created, and I can store them also to an array or to an object so that I can reference them later as well. Because right now, every time I create a new one, and it overrides the same variable. And so the event handlers, we have already seen this. So what do you think this code will do? So have a look at it. What do you think it does?
When you click, it will console log button was pressed. That text.
When you click on this demo element, right? So that it selected a demo element. We don't know exactly what element this is, what HTML. We know that it has an ID demo, but it can be a button, it can be a header, a paragraph, an image, it can be anything. Basically, it's just any element that has the ID demo. We get this, we store it in the demo variable, and so we add this event listener that when you click it, then this handler is going to be called, which will just console log button was pressed. Okay, so it's the same that we have seen in the example. We have these event listeners. And so just also in case we don't know how to link these three files together, I'm just going to repeat it again. So normally we're working with an HTML file, and JS file, and a style sheet. As I was saying, the JavaScript file will go inside the body like this with a script tag, and will specify the root to it. So here the root is just on the same folder, but if I had some subfolder, I would just specify like maybe, I don't know, JavaScript folder / playground, if I had it inside some other folder. And the CSS is linked here on the head. So we're using this link tag, and with the href, we just again specify the root to my style sheet file. So like this, these three files are linked together. We have the link of the styles here on the head, and the link of the JavaScript here on the body. CSS, you can work with CSS like vanilla CSS simple CSS, or you can use some framework. I think on Friday you mentioned some Tailwind. I haven't used Tailwind. Another very popular one is Bootstrap, and you can check a bit Bootstrap if you like, if you haven't seen it yet. So maybe it will make your life a bit easier with the CSS. We will see some example with Bootstrap. So if I wanted to include Bootstrap in my code, I would come here, include via CDN, and we'll get this link tag. And I can go to my code and add it like this. So add it again in my head. The link tag goes here for the Bootstrap. I can combine it. It doesn't mean that if I have a Bootstrap, I cannot have a CSS of my own. I can have both things, but we're not very sure which one will take effect. So it will override, one will override the other, and we'll not know where your styles come from. But anyway, you can include the Bootstrap like this. And I think it probably has changed something. I think it has changed the font, because by default, the font that the Bootstrap is using is a different one, than the one that was here. See now that every time I click this, I have more tacos and ice cream. Okay. And so you could add the Bootstrap there, and there is a good documentation and examples to see the different things. So how Bootstrap works is that instead of you defining classes, you have some classes that are already defined. And a good example is the buttons. So let's say I create a button here in my HTML. Click me. So if I just create a simple button, it's a bit ugly. It's this very gray button. Of course, now it doesn't do anything because I have not connected it with anything. I could connect the button with my event. So maybe instead of clicking the H1, when I click the button, this thing will happen. Okay, so this button now has no style. I could create the style myself. So I could create some class in here if I want for the button. So for the button, I can create some CSS and say that maybe the background color of the button is blue. And so then it will be blue. And I need maybe to do the fonts to be white so that it has more contrast. It'll be like this, but it's still, the edges are a bit rough. They are doesn't look very nice. Instead, if I want to use Bootstrap, I can go and you see that it has these buttons already created. And how does this work? You just take this class from Bootstrap. So this primary button it's a class button and button primary. This is this one. So it has already some styles created. And if you simply have Bootstrap included, as I was saying, with a CDN. So you have Bootstrap here. So that you specify that you use Bootstrap in your page. And then you go to your button and you add this class, this Bootstrap, for example, the danger button. So I should add this one here. So it automatically transforms this button to the styling specified by Bootstrap. Then, of course, if you want to change this, it will be a bit hard to change the button elements, so the colors and everything, because if you get from the Bootstrap and you want to modify Bootstrap, it's a bit harder. You need to download it and to change the styling. But at least for starting, it's a good way to quickly start and create some forms or some buttons or some elements that look nice. You have different things here. Apart from buttons, you have these messages like alert messages, or also for forms. This is quite good as well, to create these forms that they look a bit nicer, a bit rounded. So you can just copy this for your forms. You don't have to create everything from scratch now, because as I was saying, we are not going to be testing or practicing CSS that much. Okay, I think at least the slides, they don't have anything else, but there are so many more things to see on DOM and play with it. And so let me first ask some questions and we'll do some other example.
One thing that came to mind, so you had the example, each time you clicked it, more things showed up. But when you refresh the page, it automatically goes away as well, right?
Yes, it goes to the initial state. So it loads again the page from 0. And the browser doesn't really, well, it's not that it doesn't understand JavaScript, but the browser will interpret what it gets from the HTML. So the JavaScript is going to affect the HTML, and then the browser will read the HTML. It's not that the browser will be doing this thing. So it shows these items because the JavaScript has added these items to the HTML, and the browser is reading the HTML. Okay, but it's not doing the transformation like reading the JavaScript at the same time. So JavaScript affects the HTML, and then the browser gets the full HTML completed, and it shows it. So then when I refresh, since the original HTML, it doesn't have these items, then it will just read this one item. So it doesn't, yes, until I click it, it doesn't know what will happen. More questions. So another thing I want to show with the event handler, before I go with a bigger example, is that, so this change color, you remember we have added this event listener, and let me make it a bit more simple again. I will remove this. I will just leave the change of the color. And so this change color, it is an event handler. Okay, and every time we call a function, this callback function that will happen on some event that is related to an event, it automatically gets an event parameter. We don't have to pass it. It passes automatically. It takes an event object that has the event. So if I console log here the event, click this event has a lot of information that we can use. So for example, it shows where exactly the click happened, the pixel exactly in the screen in X, Y position, where did I click? X starts from left to right, and Y starts from top to bottom in web pages. Okay, so it can show this. It can show another thing that is useful. It's the target. So it shows where this event has happened, in which element. So H1, in the event has happened in the H1. Okay, so here I was using header style color green because I knew that the event has happened to header. But if I wanted to make this more specific, actually instead of header, I would use event.target style color green, because I'm going to get from the event where the target of the event, which element was the event target. And so I can reuse this function for other things. It doesn't have to write here that this is only for this element, for header. Okay, and still works. So you see that it has a lot of attributes, a lot of things the type of the event was a click, if the event was a mouse over, what type of event it was. So it has some things that we will find useful here, this event. And this event, as I was saying, it passes automatically to the function when this function is a handler. So when this function is connected with the event listener, it automatically gets the event that has happened as an input. So we can, let's see. Yes, I have some example also prepared before we go to your assignment. So this week we will be, both days we will be working with DOM, and there is one assignment that is a big assignment that has like 3 steps. But of course, today we will just start with step 1, maybe step 2, and then you have some time to also finish it during the whole week, so next time as well. And so I'm going to show you one similar example that can help you with the assignment, but it's not the assignment itself, so that yes, I can help you. So more questions that come with the elements, the event listeners, or it will come with the examples, I guess. Okay. So Joy, let me see, because she also write us a message. Okay, she cannot also attend today. Her son is still sick. Okay. No problem. We work with that other example. So I have it here somewhere. Let me see. So I'm going to, this is what we want to get to. We don't need all this. Let's start with something simpler. And I have some styles here. So what we want to do for the example today is to create a simple task controller or a to-do list. Okay, so we have a simple, very simple form. It has one input element, one button, and then when I click the task, like finish, DOM, assignment. So initially it says something, you have no tasks yet, and then when I click this, it adds this to my to-do list, and then go shopping, and then it also adds this to my to-do list, etc. So it will be adding some elements. It will be taking the input and adding some elements to my list. So when I start with this, I start with an HTML. I don't have to have everything, as I was saying, I don't have to do all the elements from scratch. There can be the basic structure that that it's already created in HTML. I don't have to do everything. So here I know that I have a header, I have an input, have a button. So my sections, I can already create them in HTML. I don't have to start with an empty page and create everything through JavaScript. Okay, what I do need to create through JavaScript is this interaction of having some input that I add something, and then a button that listens to an event when it's clicked, and then it creates a list item. So I have this, so I have also included Bootstrap here just to have it, although I also have some styles in my style sheet. And I have the page already created with the main section, and inside there is a header, H1, that is this to-do list header here. And then there is a form that I have included inside the div. A div element is a container. Normally it's used for styling. A div element itself doesn't show anything. It's only used to include other elements inside and do some kind of separation of sections and add some styling. So this div here includes my form, includes an input element of type text and the button that just says add. Okay, so this small form here, it has an input, type text, and the button. The input, you can specify different types. So it can be text, it can be email, it can be telephone, it can be URL. If I specify here something else, for example, I specify that the type of the input is email. If I try to write something that it's not an email, normally it will trigger some error here. Okay, so now it's not, I think it's because it's not inside the form. Yes, now it's not checking it because it's not inside the form. But there are different types of input and there do some kind of first validation when you try to add things. And so I have this input here and I have an ID. So I have added this ID so that I'm able to grab it a bit easier, and a button. And then I have a section, this div here, all this, where the tasks will be written. So right now, just have an H2 and that says tasks, and then a UL, an unordered list that doesn't have any element inside. And it has some text that says you have no tasks yet. So what I want to do is that when I click on a button, I'm going to take what was inside the input and I'm going to create the list item to append to the UL, same as I did before in the example that I was showing you, that I was creating through this for loop. I was creating list items and I was appending them to the list. Same I want to do now, but with the button and by getting the text now from the input. Okay, so I'm going to just put all this in comment and start. Or no, I'm going to start with a clean file. Tasks. So where do I start with this? Since I need to get what will be written inside the input, I need to be able to grab this element, the input element. So first of all, I'm going to grab the input element by document, get element by ID, and in the input, I have an ID. I have specifically put an ID so that it's easier to grab it. That is called tasked input. Okay, and so like this, I'm getting this element. And all the input elements have a value. So when I write something in here, this is stored in the value property of the input element. So if in fact well, now if I console log the input, it will just show this, but try to write something to see if it works. Let me see here. So yeah, because I have it in this my GS file. So input is this element here, and now if I run like input value, it doesn't have anything, it's empty. But if I write something in that So you see that it shows now Anna. Whatever I'm writing inside the input, it's grabbed, it's stored in the dot value property of this element. Okay, so if I want to be able to grab whatever the user is going to be writing in there, I'm going to be using this input dot value. So I have this input element, and then I also want to make sure that the button can be clicked, because right now it doesn't have any event listener. If I click it, it doesn't happen anything, that nothing happens here. So I also want to grab the element button. So I will use this time the query selector button. And so this grabs this button. And I want to add a listener to this button. So add event listener, button click. It will call an add task handler, which I have not created yet, but I will create now. So of course, yes, here I get some errors. And so what this add task function will do. So the add task function, whenever I click the button, it's going to take what is inside the input. So it's going to take the input value. Okay. And it's going to create, so let's store this somewhere. Let user input value. And then, as I was doing in my previous example, I want to create a list item. So I'm going to create a list item, document, create element of type list. I'm going to add this user input as the inner text of this list element. So the text that will appear is what the user has added. And I want to append this list element to the unordered list that I have already created in my HTML. So in here, I have this unordered list with an ID tasks list. Okay, so in order to be able to append it there, I first need to grab it. So document, get element by ID, these task lists. And so I append it. Append child. Okay, so let's review. We have basically we grab everything that we need. In fact, I could also like put this also out here so that they don't repeat it. So it's a good practice that at the beginning, we grab all the elements so that we store them in some variable so that we can use it later, all the elements that we are going to be needing. So I'm going to be needing to have a hold at input so that I get the value of the input that the user is going to be passing. I want to have the unordered list stored somewhere so that I can add children to this. And I want to have the button also stored somewhere so that I can add an event listener to this. And so whenever I click this button, the add task handler is going to be called. Then it will take the user input that is stored in the input.value. It will create an element, will pass the text to be this one, and will append it. Okay, and let's see if this works. Okay, nice. So it already creates this, another task. So we can create tasks like this. So what else can we do? First, we can see that this you have no tasks yet is still here. Okay, this element was created at the beginning. So I had this span element here when the list was empty that was saying you have no tasks yet. But what I want to do is that when I start creating tasks, I want this to disappear. Okay, so what I can do is that I can have a class already defined. I actually have this here, a class that it's called height, that has this CSS property of display none, which means that whenever this class is applied to any element, it will not be displayed on the screen. So if I went now directly here and I just added class hide, we will see that it's not appearing here on the screen anymore. But I don't want to have the class added from the beginning. I want to have the class added later, at the moment that I start adding things to my list. So in order to do this, inside the add task function, whenever I add children, I can also grab this span element. So let me grab it up here, document. I will use query selector. I could use query selector span, but since it has an ID, no tasks, I will use it with the ID here so that you also see it with the ID. Is it with capital? Yes, no tasks. So I grab this span, and what I want is whenever I call this function, so whenever a new item is added, add this class of at least add height. So I want to add this height class that I have already created to my span element. Yes, you see so first task, let's see. Add, no, let me see. This is let me see if it's like this. I will not remember the class list exactly, but we can check it also on the documents. Is that you can either test it or check it. Sometimes it's yes, right now, no add. So class list, it already adds this in the class. So right now what we did is that at the moment that we click on the button, the handler function was called, this added this item, and it also added the height class to the span, so that this element now doesn't show because it has this display none property, CSS property. Okay, questions?
How would you, I'm just thinking in terms of if you have a function that you build and it has a conditional in there, because it transforms any input into an object model, so it would all be treated as like key value. I'm just trying to think of how you would create a conditional with, for example, if there are LA items in UL, what's kind of the best way to...
What would you want to check? Like, for example, that I cannot put the same task twice?
For example, if there was an additional function that allowed you to check off any tasks that you've done, and then there are no tasks anymore, would only appear when all the tasks have been checked off.
Okay. So in here it's JavaScript, so you can put any conditional you want, and so for example you could store all these things to an array. So let's say I create some tasks array that it's an empty array at the beginning, and then whenever I call this, apart from creating the element and adding it there, I could also like push it to the tasks array. So tasks.push, and I push this user input text. So like that, I'm creating an array with all the tasks that the user has created. Then I could use this array to check, for example, before I add any new task, if this new task is already in my array. So maybe I don't want to add 2 times the same thing. So I get the user input, but I check if tasks includes user input, or basically if it doesn't include user input, then I'm doing this code, and if not, I don't. So I have, so right now, if I try to add something like was this, and then I try to add the same thing again, it's not going to add it. If I modify even a letter, it should, because the string comparison will not work, so it will find that this task is not in the array anymore. And so if you wanted to have something to cross off tasks, you would need some kind of smaller button created next to each item. So it can have like done or delete or something. And then you add some other event listener to that other button. So at the moment that I'm clicking on this smaller button here, this task is removed from the tasks array and can be also removed from the list. Yep. So yes, you can try it, you can play with this. More questions. I had more styles here because some of them are just styles for having these things like a bit centered with some padding, with some margin, and just to have this a bit better looking. But if you don't want to use any styling, it's okay. It will be a bit ugly. So if I just remove all styles, it's going to be like this. It's not that bad. So we don't have to worry too much about styling. It's not that bad because also I have Bootstrap already included, and Bootstrap gives a bit of styling. But if I also remove Bootstrap, and then of course this button primary, it's not going to understand what this is because I don't have Bootstrap anymore. Then this is like the very plain form of this. But it's okay, we can work with this, and the functionality would still be we would still be there. Okay, so for now we can also just focus on the functionality if you don't want to bother too much with CSS. Okay, and so one last thing I want to show you before we go with the exercise. So I have this exactly the same thing, but with a grid, which I think it's going to be also useful for the exercise. Not this one, yes. So let me open this. So the structure is very similar, as you see, but instead of creating a list of items with a bullet list, I just put items one next to the other to like create a grid. So for example, if I start with your names as I see them, it adds one after the other like this, add, and then Ariela, and so it adds them in a grid structure of 3 items and then as many rows as you need, right? So the button and what it does, it's the same as we have seen with the UL. If you see here, we have again an input that gets the name of the student and then a button that adds this. For now, forget about the change colors buttons. And then we have this structure here, the part where all the students will appear. But instead of being a UL list and an ordered list, it is a div that it's a grid div. And for this, I have used the bootstrap way of creating a grid, but you can also use like the CSS grid way as well, if you want to play with this. So for the bootstrap way, what it does is that you set the class row to the container. So you have this div container where all these items will be placed, and you have this set to row. And then whenever you create a new item, so in my function, so don't worry, because I have some other things here that I was playing with, but I just want to show you. So whenever you take the student and you create a new item and you add this call MD4, which is the bootstrap way of creating a grid. And I can pass you also a reference to how bootstrap is working if you want to check it, or if not, you can also use the grid that you have been playing with during the weekend. Okay, so for bootstrap, if you use these classes, you create columns. For example, with the MD4, you create 3 columns, because in bootstrap, everything is like 12, size 12. And so it's like if you have 12 boxes and you break it down as you want. So either it will be 3 or 4 of size 4, or it will be 3, 6, and 3, or it can be 8 and 4. So depending on how you create your items and which class you add to them, you will be positioning them like this in a grid format. And you have here different examples of how you can structure this with grid, but you can also use the display grid and grid columns, which is also very easy to use. The grid, I think grid is easier than flex. So this could be also done with the display grid. Again, you don't have to worry too much about the CSS, but because the assignment, it's going to need you to create some kind of grid. That's why I wanted to show you also the bootstrap. So let me go to the assignment. Where are we? Manipulating DOM. Okay. I'm going to copy this on resources. I'm sure that you are eager to start working with this. It's a bit more fun than other things. Let me see. So you have a README file that explains what we will try to do with this assignment. It has 3 steps. So the first step is to create this simple website with a very simple form and a submit button. And these boxes are supposed to be images, right? So whenever you click, so you are going to add some image URL instead of text. So I was adding text for my tasks, but instead of text, you can add here a URL. So we can go to Google, let's say, and search for cat images, and then you just grab any image, and you grab its URL, and open image. Okay, here, this one, and you can go in here and copy this URL and click add. Of course, now it adds it like this because it takes it as a text. But if you want to add an image instead of a name, and you grab the URL from here, let me see. So the item that you are going to create, it's not. Let me go to a simpler example so that I show you how to create an image. So to these tasks example. So here we were creating list item of elements of type list. But if I want to create an image, I'm going to create an image type element. So I'm going to create elements of type image. Okay, and then the image doesn't have an inner text because we don't pass any text inside the image. If you remember the image tag in HTML, what it has a source attribute where we specify the URL. Okay, so if I wanted to create this image directly in here, I would just go and do image. So it's an image tag, it has a source where you pass the URL and then it closes because it doesn't have a closing tag. And so I close it like this. And then let me open this one. Here is my image. Of course, images have their own things as well. So this is huge now. I should also, apart from creating the image, making it be a bit smaller, because this one particular that I have selected is very big. So I could make the width be 50%. So simply that it shows a bit better on screen. Okay, but the image is another tag and it has an attribute where it accepts the URL. So same as we were getting from the input from my user, where is this one? So here I was accepting some text. I can also accept some URL and get the URL and pass it to an image element in order to create to the source attribute of the image in order to create this image. And so to create one image next to the other. So this is the first thing that you have to try to do. You have to have some simple form where I'm putting an URL inside, and then by submit, it adds this image to a grid format, a 4x4 or 4x3, or how many images you add, this gets bigger. So the first step is to create a form that accepts a URL, that has a submit button, and that has some event listener to this button, that when you click the submit, the image appears on the top of the page. And then you can try to do some styling, that everything should be center aligned, the images should be positioned in a grid pattern, and you can play a bit with the style. But first try to do at least the form and the functionality working. Okay, and then as a second step, we will add some more elements to the form. So that is, apart from the image URL, we also take an image title and an image description, and we store this somewhere in an object format. Okay, so let's start with the first part, with this part. You can, whenever you have something like this, you have some design, some mock-up that is given to you. A good exercise will be to just take this image and try to imagine how it's going to be structured in HTML. So to break it a bit down, like, okay, I see here, I'm going to need some kind of header or an H1 or something. And then there is going to be some space here. Maybe I can define as a div container. That is going to be my grid. And then each element, it's also going to be maybe a div that includes an image, or maybe the image directly. And then this part here, it's going to be another section. So maybe another div that it's a form. And so maybe you can try to draw it a bit and then create the basic structure in HTML. So whatever you need to have like fixed, you can create it in HTML directly. And then you start working with the interactivity part. Okay. Questions? Let's see, let's start with this, then see what will come up. I'm here to help you. I'm going to create breakout rooms in case we need them, and call me for anything.
Thank you.